Greetings, Peter.
Hi, JD.
We're tuning up our music, and we're welcome everybody to our fourth Manier for Congress, Indiana 7th District Town Hall. And we have a very special guest named Dr. Vincent Peter Price, our friend, Executive Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, a Congressional Advisory Board dedicated to achieving protection of the United States from electromagnetic pulse, EMP, cyber attacks, mass destruction terrorism, and other threats to civilian critical infrastructures. Mm-hmm. Peter Price also is director of the United States Nuclear Strategy Forum and another advisory board to Congress, and his policies cover weapons of mass destruction. Peter, it's so good to have you 2 years later, once again at one of our campaign events. Yes. Welcome, Peter.
Well, thank you for having me, JD, and thanks for all you have done to contribute to national preparedness against EMP and cyber warfare.
Well, we go back to the Trump campaign of 2016.
Right.
And at that time, Peter, you were the person chosen to brief presidential candidates in Iowa on this existential threat, EMP. Mm-hmm. And in 2015, Christine and I got to meet one of Donald Trump's top aides down in Nashville, Tennessee, and we hooked up with exchange cards, and for a year, weekly, we would send him information for Donald Trump about this threat, and it would include your blogs, your writings, Ambassador Hank Cooper's writings.
That's right.
And we got a little feedback, and they appreciated that. So you are on top of this incredible issue, Peter, and we want you to talk a little bit about what's happening as Congress is getting ready to try to come up with a huge stimulus package.
Wow.
Well, President Trump last year on March 26th signed an executive order on coordinating national resilience to electromagnetic pulses. And didn't get a lot of attention in the press, but it may well be the most important executive order passed by this or any other president. You know, for 20 years, the EMP Commission, of which I was the chief of staff for 17 years, and a handful of other leading scientific experts, strategic experts, intelligence experts like Jim Woolsey, former CIA director, for 20 years we've been trying to get a president to pass an executive order on an emergency basis to protect our electric grid from the existential threat that is an EMP. And just in case your audience doesn't know, you know, an EMP can be caused by the sun, by a rare geomagnetic superstorm that happens, you know, once every 100, 150 years, like the Carrington event.
Right.
That could black out electric grids worldwide and put billions of lives at risk. Or a nuclear EMP attack. North Korea, China, Russia are all capable of doing this. Iran may be capable of doing this, because they may, contrary to the conventional wisdom in Washington, Iran may already have the bomb. They just orbited a satellite over us last week, by the way.
A military satellite.
Yeah, military satellite. And it wasn't, and it was the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, okay, the deadliest terrorist organization in the world, that orbited that satellite over the United States.
Wow.
I wrote an article to warn about that, too. The trajectory is very similar to the trajectory of the North Korean satellites, in that it evades our ballistic missile early warning radars and national missile defenses and approaches us from the south, from our blind side, where we have no radars, no national missile defenses, and it is a proper altitude for putting an EMP field down over North America if it were armed. They're planning, this one was probably an experiment, but they're planning to launch another one in June.
Wow.
And then there are non-nuclear EMP weapons that you can actually purchase devices without having a license even. For example, there's a device called the EMP suitcase, and it's not intended to be used as a weapon. It's a diagnostic tool that's used in industries for legitimate peaceful purposes, like designing airfields. Where should the air traffic control tower radars go, so that they have to be far enough away from the landing strip so they don't cause damage to landing aircraft, or for how far apart you need to space heavy industrial machinery so that they don't fratricide, because, big electronic machines put out electromagnetic transients, and you can, they can fratricide each other if you don't have them spaced far enough apart or don't have enough shielding. That's what the EMP suitcase is designed. And it looks just like a suitcase. It can be operated by one person, but it does put out 100,000 volts per meter over a short distance, 100 yards or so. And if some terrorist or criminal or madman bought one of these things and put it in the trunk of his car, all he'd have to go is to go out to one of those transformer substations that you see off the highway that are completely unguarded except for a chain link fence. There's not even a guard dog. And he could just turn the thing on, wait to see the sparks and flames coming out. You could black it. We've arrived at a place where you can black out a whole city, a single person with a device like that. And again, it's basically a weapon of mass destruction, and you don't even need a license to buy it. If a team of terrorists had those things, they wouldn't need a nuclear weapon. They could run around the country, and if you took out enough transformers, you could create a cascading blackout, that would black out the whole country. I mean, this happened back in 2003 with a tree branch in Ohio that started the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003 that put 50 million Americans in the dark, blacked out in New York City for a day. Subways didn't work. People had to walk home across the Brooklyn Bridge. Well, if it wasn't a tree branch and it was these non-nuclear EMP devices that were being used, the damage would be permanent. The blackout would be permanent.
Oh.
And, 9 of 10 Americans could die in a year. Anyway, when I briefed President Trump on this, he wasn't the president yet. It was in the Iowa caucuses, as JD said. I'll never forget, after it, the president hadn't heard about EMP. He was a very, very intelligent guy. He was quickly understood the significance of all this, and he was appalled that the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, appalled that none of these departments and agencies had done anything to protect the country. He wanted to know why. I told him, that the threat was so big, and there were so few people within these departments and agencies that really understood it, that it was a hot potato, and nobody wanted to take responsibility for it. The Department of Defense would say, well, the sun can cause an EMP, a natural EMP, these solar superstorms like the Carrington event. So this is not our job. It's the job of the Department of Homeland Security that deals with natural disasters. The Department of Homeland Security would say, wait a minute, you can do an EMP by a nuclear weapon, or terrorists could do it with non-nuclear weapons. So this is a Department of Defense responsibility. And then the Department of Energy and the utilities would say, well, our job is to provide electricity. It doesn't have anything to do with national security. So this belongs to either DHS or DOD, but not us. And President Trump said to me, Dr. Pry, don't worry about this. When I'm elected president, we'll knock their heads together and get this problem solved. That's almost verbatim what he said.
Wow.
And the executive order he's passed last year, in effect, delivers on that promise. Because it puts all the relevant departments and agencies in that executive order and orders them to work together on the problem. They're all on the hot seat to work on the problem and solve the problem. The president doesn't trust the bureaucrats to do it and to do it quickly, and so he is in charge. The president himself is in charge through his national security advisor.
Wow.
And they've got a report card. Every year there's a progress report that has to be delivered. 1 year after the date of the signing, March 26th. The first progress report was due this year on March 26th. And I knew what would happen.
Yeah.
I knew that these guys either would slow roll it and not have a progress report, or they would so deeply classify the progress report that outsiders, independent experts, wouldn't be able to read it, or even know of its existence. And that's what they did. One of those two things. They either didn't deliver their progress report, or they classified it. So I wrote a book that I published a couple weeks before March 26th, called The Power and the Light, the Congressional EMP Commission's War to Save America. And it is my progress report to the American people. And these guys I can tell from looking at the unclassified information, there are big things you can look tell if they're making progress that are big and obvious. Like, for example, do we have a standard yet? A standard for protecting the grid against nuclear EMP, for instance. Even if they couldn't immediately meet that standard, there ought to be a standard that, as a goal that they should work toward. But guess what? They don't have a standard like that yet. You know,
Peter, I'll interject. Those super EMP weapons that China, Russia are trying to form, are we talking 100,000 volts per meter that they can produce?
Yeah, in the military literature for Russia, they describe super EMP weapons that can generate 100,000 to 200,000 volts per meter.
Wow.
The hardest, the heaviest, the best protected U.S. military systems are only hardened to 50,000 volts per meter.
Mm-hmm.
So what the super EMP weapons can do, is far exceed even, and not much, only a handful of things like Air Force One, the strategic command and control systems for our nuclear deterrent, and nuclear missiles and bombers themselves. Only that stuff is hardened even to 50,000 volts per meter. Most of the military, the rest of the military, which is 95% of our military, isn't really hardened at all. And so an EMP would be able to paralyze all of it if you put 100,000 volts per meter on the ground, because that far exceeds the hardening standard that we have. And these super EMP weapons are not in development. They exist now. The Russians, the Chinese have got them. The EMP Commission thinks that North Korea almost certainly has them. And they were even concerned that these two North Korean satellites that orbit over us might even be armed for nuclear EMP attack right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's worrisome that, that Iran now, especially the Islamic Revolutionary Guard,
right.
These fanatical terrorists who have sworn to take revenge against the United States for the execution of their leader, back in January.
Right.
General Soleimani, was assassinated very publicly by President Trump. And, of course, the president had to do that, although I think he got bad advice in doing it so overtly. Back in my day, there was a time when the CIA was able to do those things more discreetly and keep your fingerprints off of it. I think he got bad advice for the United States to take public credit, put words around that. It could and should have been arranged so that it looked like anybody could have done it. And because there's a lot of people that hate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in the Middle East, and General Soleimani could have been the Israelis, the Jordanians, the Saudis, the UAE, or even the Islamic revolutionaries themselves.
Right.
Those criminals knock each other off all the time. So I've often wondered myself whether this is another conspiracy against President Trump from our not too competent and dishonest intelligence community, where somebody talked the president or advised the president into basically taking personal responsibility for the execution of the most dangerous terrorist in the world. Now there's a price on his head, and that's going to follow him out of the White House.
Yes.
So that's another topic. President Trump has.
And you worked for the CIA for a few years there. I want to let our viewers know.
Yeah, it was my privilege to serve in the CIA for a decade, from during the most dangerous years of the Cold War, from 1985 to 1995, when the Soviet Union was at the height of its military power and was seriously considering launching World War III.
Yeah.
And then through its decline and and fall and disintegration, and then the resurgence with Russia.
Right.
And now we're back in a new Cold War with Russia.
That's right.
Well, Peter, it's incredible that just a few hours ago the Democrats unveiled a $3 trillion Phase 4 infrastructure stimulus bill.
Wow.
And $3 trillion, you got to compare that to our 2020 federal budget of $4.7 trillion. So it almost is equal to the entire federal budget. But they've got a lot of money that they're willing to spend, like $90 billion to the Department of Education. I'm going someplace for you with this. They've got $25 billion they want to give to the Postal Service, and you can see there's not a lot of money going towards COVID-19 with some of this stuff. But you told Donald Trump, and assessed what America could first do to harden the grid. And you gave him a figure, and you still stand by these figures. So I want our people to know.
Yeah, it was the EMP Commission back in 2008 estimated it would cost $2 to $3 billion, to protect the grid, which is what we were giving away in foreign aid to Pakistan every year at the time until President Trump wisely stopped that policy, because Pakistan is not our friend. And today, in 2020 dollars, it's probably, something like $3 to $4 billion to protect the grid. Though that was the EMP Commission estimate. There are other estimates, some of them lower, some of them much higher, but it depends upon how much security, you want to buy. I still endorse the EMP Commission plan. But if people were willing to spend, $20, $30 billion, I would certainly support that too. A colleague of mine, George Baker, and others have suggested a much more robust plan for defending. See, the EMP Commission plan was based on the idea that you would harden selectively key parts of the grid, like transformers and generators and control systems, and that you would also require the Department of Homeland Security to work with utilities to have a plan, a recovery plan in place, so that on an emergency basis, there would be a temporary blackout, but with good planning and with the core equipment protected, we could get away with spending as little as $2 to $4 billion and bring the country back quickly enough before millions of people started dying from starvation. The other plan, which I think, if we're going to spend trillions of dollars,
yes,
30 to 40 billion is not a lot of money to spend.
Right.
That plan is basically what you might call the idiot-proofed plan, so that we don't have to rely on the utilities or the Department of Homeland Security or anybody to do anything. It would harden everything up to a military standard, so that we wouldn't even know the EMP happened. The lights would stay on, everything would be protected, and we could just forget about this problem. It would be no more dangerous to us than lightning is, And I think lightning is a good example, because lightning is a form of natural EMP, which we as a society long ago decided to protect ourselves from, because it happens so often. We couldn't afford to ignore it. And so almost everything in almost all the electronics have lightning protection, including the personal computer on your desk. If you look at the plug that goes in the wall, it's kind of a fat plug. It's because there's a little surge arrestor in there. So if there's a lightning strike on the power line, it won't destroy your computer. Same principle. I mean, the EMP from a nuclear weapon or from the sun is much more powerful than lightning. But the similar technology just scaled up. Surge arresters, blocking devices, Faraday cages. We could scale that all up and start designing our electronics to be hardened against all of these EMPs. Call them super lightning, okay? And that would make the problem go away in the long term.
Well, Peter, we've got a viewer, a friend of ours, and Christina's going to read a question. He's one from Florida, and she's going to read this question because I think it's right up your alley.
Yeah, we can do this. Amazing. The name is also Peter.
Yes.
Peter Karakas. Can Congress take measures to protect our grid down here in Florida so we do not suffer our power being out for weeks at a time during the hurricane season?
Yeah, they can. And the state of Florida, by the way, you don't have to rely on Washington to protect your grid. I wrote another book called Blackout Wars that describes how a number of states, including Florida, try to take or have taken. Some states have actually moved out on their own and aren't waiting for Washington, and started protecting their grids. Florida tried to do that. There was she was then a Democrat, Michelle Raywinkle Vasalinda, was a state representative, and she introduced a number of bills in the Florida state legislature, none of which passed, unfortunately, but they did become models for other states to follow. Some of the legislation was really excellent and found a way around the lobbyists. One of the biggest obstacles to getting the country protected has been the electric utilities, because they have millions of dollars to spend on lobbying and to make campaign contributions and the like. And they have always been a big obstacle to trying to make progress. But yes, so you did have a Florida state legislature that tried to do that. I actually, back in after when Governor DeSantis was first elected, I was I was up in Canada at the time, but I ended up having a teleconference with him on Canada and from Canada to talk to him and his staff about what Florida could do. And the conversation was well received. I don't know what progress has been, but Florida doesn't have to wait for Congress to act. Florida can act on its own. And the business about the hurricanes, you will be able to tell if they're actually doing their job and they've actually started protecting. Because if you harden the grid against a threat like EMP, lesser threats like severe weather, like hurricanes, would also be greatly mitigated by EMP protection. So you wouldn't have the long recovery times, or you might not have blackouts at all if it's done right. So that's something to keep your eyes on. In Florida, if the utilities and the state start saying, well, we are protecting against cyber threats and against EMP and stuff, you'll know if they're telling the truth or not by how the grid performs when it gets hit by a hurricane. Because the problems that happen with hurricanes, a lot of the problem is not just knocking down power lines. That of course always happens during a hurricane. But the big problem from blackout recovery is that the energy from the down power lines has to go somewhere. And what it happens is it backs up into transformers and control systems in the form of a system-generated overvoltage, which destroys the transformers and control systems. And if you had blocking devices and surge arresters on the transformers and control systems that were capable of handling a nuclear EMP, there is no hurricane that can induce a system-generated overvoltage that is more powerful than a nuclear EMP. The transformers and control systems would be protected from that hurricane too. It's easy to string power lines back and put the power line towers up. The biggest problem in recovery is replacing transformers and control systems that have been destroyed. Because those are very expensive. Some of them are huge and difficult to move and to replace. But so, Florida can act, and Congress has tried actually already to pass legislation. During the Obama administration, Senator Ron Johnson and Representative Trent Franks, who was then a member of Congress, a great hero on this issue.
Yes, Arizona.
Passed a bill called the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, and it required, as a matter of law, that the Department of Homeland Security would start working on a strategy to protect all the critical infrastructures, including the electric grid, from EMP, and it required DHS to start launching pilot programs in the states. Now, in the constitutional republic that I grew up in,
yes,
when Congress passed a law, or the President of the United States passed an executive order, it was the job of the U.S. government to jump up and salute and make it happen. But now we know, and one of the valuable things that's happened, I think, is all of us have been educated, and even I was educated on this, and I've been working professionally in the national security area all my professional life. I'm 65 now.
Wow.
And it took the deep state to rear its ugly head and try to, the coup d'etat against President Trump, for even me to understand that we do have this creature that the founders were afraid of, that the rise of an independent administrative state, a permanent bureaucracy that has its own mind and its own views, and is willing to defy or at least sabotage and use subterfuge to thwart the will of presidents and congresses, because they think they know better than presidents and congresses, even though they're not elected and they don't have any legitimate mandate to pursue the policies they want to do. And that's what my book is about on this issue, about the executive order. It's not enough to just have an excellent executive order, which President Trump did give us. It has to be implemented competently. And those guys are not doing it right now.
Well, back to Florida, there were senior citizens in Hollywood Hills, not Hollywood, California, who died a couple hurricane seasons ago, and I did some research on the people who wrote that up in the papers, local papers, and within less than a mile, there was the railroad tracks next to, within a mile of that hospital. And the power just went out, got very hot, 100 degrees, and 30 people died.
Wow.
There's a program that your friend Ambassador Cooper and I are working on that would start, because that was recommended by the Congressional EMP Commission, that we have a fleet of mobile diesel locomotives that could go around. One diesel locomotive can power up 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 homes. Mm-hmm. And but it's been kind of hard with the deep state, Peter, as you well know. But our prayer is this is going out and be recorded, and we're going to get this to some ranking officials. We're going to try, and certainly some people up there in Congress, Senator Johnson and some others. And I just feel this is the time, if they're talking about $3 trillion, wouldn't you say, let's say the state of Florida, whatever they spend on hardening the grid, they're going to get that money back, aren't they?
Oh, yes. One of the advantages of protecting the grid, and especially if the state of Florida decided to do it on its own, and not wait for Washington, you'd be EMP protection. EMP is the core. EMP, cyber warfare, these things we've been talking about, these are the military threats of the future. And preparing to address these military threats of the future, if you build the surge arresters, the blocking devices, and the expertise to protect grids, that's the defense industry of the future. You know, those states which are the first to protect themselves and have that expertise, they're going to be able to sell that expertise to other states. They're going to be able to sell that expertise around the world to other countries that are threatened by EMP. I remember, years ago, what was the year? I think it was 2009. Yes, it was 2009 when I was the president of Impact America. It was the first nonprofit to work on the EMP threat. And we had a big conference in Niagara Falls that drew 1,000 people. And it sort of started the national EMP movement in the United States to get the country protected. Wow. And we actually had people come from Taiwan and South Korea looking for people, looking for businesses in the United States that had expertise on EMP that could sell them equipment and knowledge to protect their electric grids. And unfortunately, we had nothing to give them, you know, because our government has been so remiss on this. Only the Department of Defense really has the expertise at this point, you know, and the defense contractors that work for the Department of Defense. But Florida could hire those same defense contractors and help them develop expertise in the state of Florida and get the grid protected there. And then it would pay for itself. Another thing is government agencies, international businesses, all kinds of big businesses are interested in energy security. You know, nobody wants to be working in an area where you might have lots of blackouts or a grid is completely unprotected, so that you can have cyber-generated blackouts or an EMP-type blackout. Those things are costly. And so it would be a big attraction for a state to be able to say, we've got a secure energy environment in this state. You know, you don't have to worry about a blackout happening. You know, we'll be able to support your industry here. And that's going to be much more attractive to the military. As a matter of fact, it's a requirement now for new military bases, you know, that the civilian grid in the areas where they're going to locate be protected. And that's understandable, because the military can't afford to have blackouts either. It's an even bigger requirement for them than it is for international businesses. So every time you get a new military base, we all know what happens then. There are all kinds of satellite industries that move in around that military base to support the military base. You know, high-tech industries, software, cyber, whatever function they have. So that's the story on Florida. And I wrote a book called Blackout Wars that has the story in it about the efforts to protect the state of Florida, which unfortunately were unsuccessful. By the way, my friend and colleague who worked help, and we're less interested than the Republicans in protecting Florida from EMP. Michelle switched from being a Democrat to being a Trump Republican.
Hey.
Now she's a strong Trump Republican.
Good.
And she feels that the Democrat Party that she had identified with was the Democrat Party of John F. Kennedy,
Right.
and that no longer exists.
Right.
The way she describes it is much the way Ronald Reagan described it. Reagan, had once been a Democrat, and he said, "I didn't change my mind. The Democrat Party left me." And I think that a lot of Americans
Right.
feel the same way. That the priority on protecting this country, having a high priority to do that, is lacking, and you can see it in the Democrats' proposal for spending. None of it is really oriented toward. They're not wanting to put a penny toward this cause.
Wow.
But I'm very confident that President Trump, there's a really good chance that the infrastructure spending, may well include and should include. And I know there are people in the White House who want to include
Yes.
the EM protection
Yes.
as part of the critical infrastructure modernization program, and it should be. It's something we need to do quickly because we're frankly running out of time. The world is becoming such a dangerous place,
Yeah.
and the sun isn't going to wait on us forever. We're actually overdue for another Carrington event.
Wow.
NASA estimates 12% per decade.
Yes.
The likelihood is up to 12% per decade now. That's frighteningly high.
Wow.
That virtually guarantees that within our lifetimes are no later than the lives of our grandchildren,
Yeah.
we're going to get hit by the big one from the sun.
Well, Peter, to bring into focus all this spending Congress is doing, and I know our voters and people watching, they're really familiar and they're watching these bills. We're talking many trillions of dollars to, in essence, to keep the death toll down, and it's probably going to be about 100,000 for 1 year, isn't it, from COVID-19? On the other hand, as you pointed out, they're wanting to spend, and every life is so precious. That's why we talked about the senior citizens dying in the hurricane down in Hollywood Hills a few years ago. Right. So precious. But your EMP commission pointed out that after 1 year, you would have 90% of Americans would be dead. That's 300 million people.
Yes, that's right. I really think that the president has been poorly advised by Fauci and company and Birx, and this idea about shutting down the economy and then engaging in massively destructive deficit spending just against the coronavirus.
Right.
What they've already spent on the coronavirus would have paid for the following. It would have paid for protecting all of the critical infrastructures of the United States from EMP and cyber warfare.
Wow.
It would have paid for launching space-based missile defenses, 1,000 space-based missile interceptors, so that we could render obsolete the nuclear missiles of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and protect ourselves from that threat with a shield.
Wow.
It would have paid for modernization of the U.S. nuclear deterrent delivery systems, all the bombers, the missiles, and the submarines. It would have paid for the modernization of all the nuclear weapons that have to go on those. It would have paid for the modernization of the scientific industrial base that makes our nuclear weapons. And we still would have had $1 trillion to spare after all of that. But all of that instead has been spent on the coronavirus.
Wow.
And now Secretary of Defense Esper and many others are starting to speak up and say, well, now that we've spent all that and we've gone so deeply into debt over the spending, they're talking about flat defense budgets in the future, so that we're not going to be able to do the modernization and repairing of our military that is still necessary. Because I know what President Trump says, that and he has to. He's the president of the United States. He can't go out there and say, well, we still haven't repaired the damage from the Obama administration and our forces are still weak. The president can't and shouldn't say that. But speaking among ourselves,
Right.
the fact is the damage from the Obama years has still not been repaired.
That's true.
With these new bombers and missiles and warheads, the ones that we are planning, before coronavirus, they were at least a decade away.
Yeah.
And the rebuilding our ammunition stockpile and modernizing our general purpose forces, our conventional non-nuclear forces, is also going to take many years. It's impossible to do that in just 3 years.
Wow.
Now, we've taken steps in the right direction, but it's only been 3 years. And what's going to happen? Are we going to be able to? Well, I would say we cannot afford to not
Yes.
modernize all these. We must
Right.
do it, but it's going to be much harder and much more painful. And can we do it? Conservatives will all agree. You and I, my friends, will all agree, yes, we must do it. But the Democrats aren't going to agree to that.
Sure.
And we've got too many establishment, middle-of-the-road type Republicans who think, frankly, like Democrats a lot of the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And they're going to, they're called budget hawks or deficit hawks.
Right.
And they're more concerned about the deficit than they are about our national security. We've got a lot of those on the Republican side. And so I could easily see the spending on the coronavirus as being catastrophic for our national security in the future.
Sure.
Because it'll be very hard. President Trump can't do it all on his own. He needs the Congress to be with him. And that's why J.D. Manier has to go to Congress.
There you
So that
go.
we'll have a strong, solid conservative to back the president and do the right thing to get us through the most dangerous times that I've ever seen in my professional life. And I've been
Wow.
30 years, working in Washington on these national security matters. And Ambassador Cooper has been working like 40, 50 years. And
Wow.
he, too,
Yeah.
whenever we talk about this, we say, these times are the most dangerous times we've ever seen. Our country is threatened from so many directions, not just the Soviet Union now, but a resurgent Russia that, which for the first time has gained major advantages over us in the nuclear balance that they never enjoyed in the Cold War. They've got a 10-to-1 superiority in tactical nuclear weapons, 10-to-1. They never had that in the Cold War. China's now talking about massively expanding its nuclear arsenal as a condition of its entering into arms control talks with us, so they can talk to us as an equal. So we'll have the equivalent of basically 2 USSRs to deal with in Russia and China.
Wow.
And I frankly think China already has a massive nuclear arsenal. They've just been hiding it from us in the underground Great Wall. And then, of course, a nuclear North Korea that can strike us. That never existed in the Cold War. And I personally believe Iran is already a nuclear weapons state. So that's 4 axes, plus you have to add international terrorism to the
Yes.
5 major axes, 5 major potential existential threats to us that we didn't have to face and deal with during the Cold War. Is looking like is looking like a benign situation compared to the new Cold War, when we face this new excess of evil that comprises these 5 really bad actors, not just the Soviet Union anymore.
Peter, to buttress what you're saying, this morning Cal Thomas in the Daily Signal from Heritage pointed out this year China is going to put in the field a new stealth bomber. And they've spent massive amount of money on missiles and their Navy. And they do have generals with military doctrines that would use nukes to try to take Taiwan, or even try to hit our west coast. I mean, it's in their doctrines. You've been watching this for years. And yet the solution, if we're going to open up the checkbook, as the Dems are so want to do, I think stronger heads, more realistic heads, and say, well, okay, wait a minute. Let's use a few billion and follow Peter Pry's path. Let's harden this grip. It's going to pay for itself. Florida will be dancing in the streets when the next hurricane comes and they keep their power on. They're just billions of dollars that are spent by the insurance companies during every one of those big hurricane seasons in the Gulf area, and sometimes up all the way to New York. So there's hope here, I think. Your message is going to get out. It must. The truth will set people free, like Lincoln said. And how can people get your books, Peter?
Oh, all my books are available through Amazon.com. If you just go to the Amazon.com line, type in my name, Peter Pry, Amazon.com. And the title of any of my books, The Power and the Light, which is the most recent one. Blackout Wars tends to be the most popular. And I think that's because in Blackout Wars, I had It actually has an executive order, a blank executive order. All the governor of any state has to do is sign the name of his state, then sign that executive order, and it'll start that state on the pathway toward protecting itself from EMP and cyber warfare. My most recent book, The Power and the Light, will basically make an instant EMP expert out of the reader, and I hope will recruit average Americans into the struggle. This is sort of a new American revolution that we need.
Yeah.
We can't sit back and just hope for our elected leaders, including President Trump, to do the heavy lifting all by themselves. America has always depended on an activist citizenry to get out there and fight. We need people, to write to their senators, to write to their congressmen, to develop an expertise on this by reading books like The Power and the Light. Send them a copy of the book. Praise President Trump for what he's done. I've got a whole chapter in there on President Trump and his executive order. And I named the names of the bad guys in the Trump administration who are working against the president.
Wow.
Back me up and write a letter to the president and say, hey, I read this in chapter 11 of this book. Fire these guys. Maybe they'll get fired, when there's enough of a public outcry. These people, deserve and need to be fired. And, President Trump delivers on his promise. Remind him that he promised to drain the swamp.
Yeah.
Get those people out of there. Those are Obama holdovers. Every single high-ranking bureaucrat that's responsible for implementing President Trump's EMP executive order was a holdover from the Obama administration. What is this? How do you expect, the executive order to be implemented competently when you have people who are fundamentally hostile to the president in charge of his policy? They have a vested interest in its failure. And we all know that this is true across the board. It's no mystery that so much has not been accomplished in terms of securing the border and protecting our economy. Almost everything that President Trump has managed to do, he's had to do by executive order, because he's working against a government that still basically is the Obama administration. Here's a litmus test: his intelligence community, President Trump's intelligence community, right?
Right.
I've been so disappointed in one after another director of national intelligence. President Trump, for example, Dan Coats, who's a conservative, okay? And President Trump made him his director of national intelligence. So Coats goes and becomes the director of national intelligence. And instead of going there and firing people, which is what the president promised to do, and following the president's policies, Coats immediately gets captured by the permanent staff there at the intelligence community, and he starts sounding like an Obama administration official.
He does.
A litmus test. Now, finally, we got this guy. Finally, Trump got an ambassador from the State Department who was a friend. This ambassador from Germany, Grenier, who was not part of the intelligence community. And so he finally put an outsider into the intelligence community, a smart outsider who knows what the score is, that he has to be anti-establishment, that he's got to deal. And only then, 3 years into the Obama administration, have we finally gotten these unclassified transcripts out that prove that President Obama himself, has been in charge of this attempted coup, and that it was an attempted coup.
Yes.
Right.
All of us have suspected that.
Right.
It seems obvious from a common sense point, but now we have the proof. 3 years it took. Why didn't Dan Coats do that on day one of the Trump administration? Person after person gets captured by these staff. A litmus test about are we winning the war against the deep state in the intelligence community. Do you know that national intelligence estimate that said that Trump was a Manchurian candidate, that the Russian influence, the Russians favored his election and they colluded, or they used their efforts to get Trump to get Trump elected president, and that became the basis for the fake Mueller investigation? That national intelligence estimate is still out there. It hasn't been recalled.
Wow.
I find that unthinkable, that somebody who has had the high privilege and honor of being appointed by the president to be the director of national intelligence, that they wouldn't, the first thing that they should do is go in there and tear up that national intelligence estimate. At least recall it and launch another investigation and say, wait a minute, we're changing the team to analyze the data on this because it's so suspicious and politically, politically motivated. It's so obviously politically motivated, But, this is part of the problem. I think our president has had a difficult time because he,
It's the swamp.
It's a hardball game. Business is a hardball game, and being a businessman teaches you a lot about life and human nature. But Washington is a real dirty game. It's far dirtier than business, and nothing. People who think they're hardball players in business haven't met anything until they've run into the Washington bureaucracy.
That's right.
And you've been fighting that for years, Peter.
Yeah, these people are ideologically motivated to their core, and they won't hesitate to send the other political party and their leaders to prison. That's what they tried to do with General Flynn and so many of the other.
Yes.
They want to send President Trump to prison if they could get him impeached and send him to prison if he could.
Right.
This is a totalitarian movement we're fighting against.
Yeah.
People need to get informed and help.
Peter, we'd be
That's how we help
remiss.
the American.
Love you, Peter.
Sorry.
We'd be remiss. President Trump recently signed another executive order on May 1st. And I think this brings hope because it, in essence, is going to mandate Buy American First when it comes to our electric grid, won't it?
Yes, that's right. This executive order wants to end our foreign dependency. I mean, one of the few good things we've learned from the coronavirus is that it's not smart to depend on foreign sources, especially China, for anything that's vital to the United States.
Right.
We've won this because so many of our medical equipment and pharmaceuticals have come from China.
Right.
And they basically cut us off. So the president has had to take control and get this stuff made in America or acquired from whatever source. Well, it would be fatal for us to rely on China for electrical equipment, and we do depend on a lot of our electrical equipment does come from China, unfortunately. Wow. So the executive order, and even if you're talking about allies like Germany and South Korea, you don't want to be dependent on any foreign country or equipment that is vital to the survival of the American people. An A8 extra high voltage transformer, for example, is just as important to our survival as an aircraft carrier or a jet fighter.
Yes.
Or a tank. You wouldn't trust the Russians or the Chinese to make those for us, would you? Of course not. We need to make those things in America, including things that upon which the lives of 330 million Americans depend, like the control systems for our electric grid. Even if the South Koreans and Germans are allies, they supply a tremendous amount of equipment to us. Most of our extra high voltage transformers come from them. But the chain of custody, if you just think about it, something has to be manufactured overseas, then shipped to the United States, then moved, long distances and installed. The chain of custody is so long and so easily penetrated that it presents too many opportunities for hostile foreign intelligence services. And we should know this from our own experience. We managed to sabotage Iran's nuclear program with the Stuxnet worm. In order to do that, we had to penetrate one of the most secure facilities in the world, the Fordo underground complex, where Iran, has centrifuges that enrich the uranium for their nuclear program. One of the most secure facilities in the world. We developed the Stuxnet worm here, a cyber weapon, in the United States, and the Israelis, Mossad, managed to penetrate that facility and insert the worm so that we could damage their nuclear program. And if we could do that, right, and we could penetrate Fordo, just think what Russia, China, North Korea, Iran could do to U.S. transformers and control equipment that's being manufactured in some place like South Korea and Germany by private industries. They're not secure like Fordo. These things are wide open to penetration by hostile foreign intelligence services. They have to be made here in America. And it it won't be able to start immediately because it's going to take us time to rebuild our defense industrial base.
Yes.
I mean, our industrial base for making these things. But this executive order is going to lean hard, on utilities to start buying American, and hopefully, the sooner the better. That we end these foreign dependencies, so that our whole electric grid is made here in America.
Well, Peter, you're pointing out there are more viruses than just what comes through the air and comes through our airports and unfortunately gets into our populace. There are the technical, terrible viruses that can take down entire flow control systems. We could take down the water. It could take down, if it comes from the wrong nation, it could, with time, it could take down our entire electric grid, and we've got to stop that.
Yes, that's right. I mean, look how, I think another good thing that might have come out of the coronavirus is I think there's a heightened sensitivity among average Americans now about how very fragile our society is.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
The coronavirus itself is, it's not the bubonic plague.
Right.
It's not genetic. It's not a real biological weapon like genetically engineered anthrax that can kill 90% of its victims.
Right.
In fact, when it's all done, like you said, JD, the deaths are going to be down to 100,000 a year, 100,000 or something like that. Which is comparable to what the number of people that die from flu.
Right.
And and so the threat is chiefly a psychological threat. That's what it is.
Right.
But even this psychological threat, look what it's done to our society.
Yeah.
It's panicked our government into shutting down the economy. I think more people are going to die, as President Trump said today on television. More people are going to die from alcoholism and suicide, drug use, all the things that are associated with an economy that goes into recession or depression. And in the end of the day, the cure is going to be far worse than the cold, as it were. But I think the lesson, the valuable thing, as I said, is that it underscores just how our society is so fragile that this has happened to us, not from a real existential threat, but just from a psychological threat.
Right.
Imagine what will happen if we get hit with a real existential threat, something that shuts down the electric grid, for example, and all those other life-sustaining critical infrastructures. So you can't get water when you turn on the faucet. Your car won't run.
Right.
You can't heat your house. Air conditioning systems don't work. And
Yes.
there's no food. No food. The amount of food in local grocery stores, typically under normal consumption rates, is only enough for 3 days. What happens after 3 days?
Yeah.
Well, Peter, you wrote a book that was used by National Geographic to make a movie, Electric Armageddon. And so we're urging people to get on Amazon and get your works. We'll talk with you offline about some activists in your own state of Florida. I think they're going to sign up now this season, and because this is the cause. This is the cause, especially they start talking about trillions of dollars. Let's spend a few billion and harden our electric grid. Let's make us more resilient than we've ever been before. Let's come out of this, as the president is calling, stronger than ever before. And it's been such a blessing to have you on. It's been a long time, but we'll get you a recording of this, and it's going out. And we appreciate you so much.
Yes.
Our blessings and love to you and your family.
Well, thank you so much, JD. And I'll never forget the miracles that you've worked up there in Indiana. That prove when I think of what you did in Indiana, for example, getting us a couple of national security conferences in the Indiana War Memorial. And I thought Indiana was going to be one of the states that would be the first to get protected, because I remember my first experience up there. Your friend C.J. Noe and you got me a meeting with then Governor Pence.
Yes.
On one day, I went from briefing top Homeland Security and electrical security people and cybersecurity people, went from briefing them in one day to meeting with the governor.
Right.
And it looked like we were in one day going to break all kinds of records to get Indiana protected.
Yeah.
But I guess he got distracted by having to become vice president of the United States. But that's the kind of miracle J.D. Menard has been able to work in Indiana. And man, when you get the power of a congressional seat, I'm sure you're going to be one of the fighters. And you're not going to abandon the president the way the Republican Party did.
Yeah.
That's why we need people like you. We need to get We need to change the team down there so that we have more people who share the values of average Americans the way President Trump does.
And with that, we want to say thank you, Peter. We're going to get you a copy. Oh, God bless. Do you have anything to close out with, Christina?
Wow. And we need to really be in all the wealth of information that we've been given. It's real.
We're going to get the transcripts.
It's real. And people just really need to begin to study this and look at this. And most importantly, all of us, look up. Our redemption really does draw nigh. And we're seeing the reality of this, but we are also to take hope and to take heart, even in all what has been given to us today. That if we work together and not keep fighting against everything and fighting against the truth, we will be able to be again that nation, and we will be able to see a real good future come into our America, into the world, by the grace of God. And like we always say, and so many times, God bless America, but in this hour, we're looking at the reality, God save America.
And thank you. And thank
Well,
you,
amen
listeners.
to that. I thank you for interviewing me. I miss you guys.
Yes.
Good luck.
Oh,
Thank
thanks
you.
so much.